Welcome, fellow night owls and history enthusiasts, to another journey into the shadows of the past. Let your mind settle. You're about to drift gently into the slow rhythm of history, not the loud history of conquests or courts, but the quiet, deliberate kind. The kind where people got up before the sun and trimmed leaves, moved water, and made sure no slippered foot of royalty ever touched dry soil. Tonight, we go back to Mughal India specifically, to its great imperial gardens, and the men who kept them blooming while the emperor slept soundly in his bed. Let's begin. Not with emperors or wars, but with silence, the silence of pre-dawn. In a Mughal palace was something cultivated deliberately. Though cities like Agra or Lahore buzzed with activity by midday, within the garden walls of the palace, quiet was currency, and nowhere was that silence more sacred than in the sleeping quarters of the Padishah, the emperor himself. The Mughal court was a place of grandeur, yes, but also of subtle rituals and invisible labor. The courtiers, cooks, perfumers, eunuchs, scribes, tutors, astronomers, painters, and laundrymen all had their hours. But among them, the gardeners, those quiet custodians of the living palace, worked the strangest hours of all. Their primary task, of course, was water. You see, Mughal emperors were obsessed with gardens, not just for leisure, but as a kind of living philosophy. The Persian concept of Shabaga, quadrilateral garden divided into 4 parts by water channels, was not merely aesthetic, it was cosmological. A garden was a miniature universe, flowing water, flowering trees, terraced levels, and quiet paths, all designed to reflect paradise. Babur, the first Mughal emperor, once wrote in his memoirs that a garden is the noblest of all pleasures, and indeed no palace or fortress, no matter how fortified, was complete without a carefully constructed green space. But watering these paradises, especially during dry seasons, was a logistical riddle. One might imagine fountains gushing and streams murmuring throughout the day, but that would disturb the royal rest. Emperors did not like to be woken by the sound of clattering buckets, squeaking pulleys, or shouting laborers, and so imperial horticulture became an art of discretion. Gardeners, known in Persian as bagbans, had to move like ghosts in the early hours before dawn. The bagbans would begin their slow ritual. Some used the rahata, Persian wheel-powered, by oxen walking in endless circles. It drew water from underground wells, sending it into raised channels, but the noise of the oxen was often too much. So, for quieter tasks, they relied on hand-lifting devices like the karaza, simple contraption of 2 leather buckets tied to ropes. The gardener would lower one bucket into a cistern or stepwell, then use a seesawing motion to draw water and gently pour it into narrow stone runnels that crisscrossed the garden beds. The sound of water trickling was acceptably and encouraged. It was part of the auditory experience of paradise, but not too much. A gardener's job was to keep the water flowing just enough that the roses and jasmine wouldn't wilt, and the emperor wouldn't stir. They walked barefoot. That part is worth lingering on. Bagbans in the Mughal court were required to remove their shoes before entering certain sections of the garden, closest to the palace's sleeping quarters. Leather soles scuffed the gravel, and even the rustle of a slipper could carry in the still air. Many went barefoot out of reverence, but also out of necessity. Their footsteps had to be as quiet as the dew. Then there were the water schedules. Not all plants could be watered at the same time. Certain flowers, like the fragrant kura or campa, needed their roots misted just before sunrise. Others, like saffron crocus, were sensitive to waterlogging. Gardeners carried small notebooks, sometimes stitched into their waistbands, the best hours for each variety. These notes were often passed down from father to son, or shared in hushed exchanges over shared clay cups of milk at dusk. Interestingly, Mughal gardens were designed not just for their visual symmetry, but also for efficiency. Channels were sloped very precisely by mere centimeters, so that water moved slowly from one quadrant to another. The entire garden became a silent clock, each corner watered in sequence by gravity alone. A good gardener merely had to lift the first sluice gate and let the system whisper into motion. Of course, not every garden could rely on such elegance. Some palaces, particularly those in drier regions like Rajasthan or the Deccan, required elaborate underground water systems, called qanats. These were gently sloping tunnels that brought water from distant sources, often buried meters below the ground to prevent evaporation. Inspecting and maintaining these silent lifelines was also the job of the gardener, or, more specifically, the Nakashi Bugda, garden engineer. These men moved underground, working by lamplight, clearing debris with curved bronze scrapers, making sure the water kept flowing to the surface without a sound. One surviving record from the court of Shah Jahan tells of a gardener named Gulbaz, who once spent 3 days unclogging a collapsed qanat outside the Shalimar Bog in Lahore. He emerged covered in mud, clothes torn. When the emperor was told of his work, he ordered Gulbaz to be bathed, clothed, and fed quietly. Of course, and gifted him a tiny plot of land within the garden, a paradise within paradise. But it wasn't just irrigation that required silence. Even pruning was an art of stealth. The Mughal garden had to be constantly clipped, shaped, and brushed. Thorny bushes were carefully managed so they didn't grow too close to the walkways. With hand-forged shears-quiet ones, well-oiled gardeners would snip at rose stems under moonlight. Dried leaves were removed with long-handled brushes made of soft peacock feathers sometimes. Gardeners carried copper bells filled with sand to scatter around freshly planted bulbs. Why? Not to signal anything, but because the soft crunch of sand underfoot warned them not to step on the garden beds while walking backward. The gardeners knew every tree by its needs. Neem trees liked to be shaded in early summer. Pomegranate trees needed the soil packed down after every watering. Ashoka trees were trimmed into narrow pyramids, their leaves turned inward to create a sense of enclosure. There were even whisperings that a few older trees, like the 300-year-old mango tree in the Fetafur Sikri garden, were to be greeted silently every morning with a slight bow. Whether this was ritual or superstition, the records do not say. And so, under the weight of all this silent responsibility, the Bagbons performed their choreographists, men moving slowly through fragrant air, barefoot on cobbled stone, carrying ancient water to thirsty roots. All to ensure that when the emperor woke and walked through his garden at dawn, everything was perfect. But not all mornings were perfect. What happened when a fountain stopped flowing? Or a squirrel chewed through a cedar branch, sending it crashing onto the tiled walkway? What did a gardener do when the emperor's sleep was disturbed? That question leads us to the next part of our quiet tale. Mistakes, moonlight, and Mughal disciplinamate this. The sun has not yet broken the horizon. The marble pavilions of the Mughal palace are still wrapped in the soft blue-grey haze of pre-dawn. A single gardener kneels beside a flower bed gently, tucking soil around the base of a marigold plant. The only sounds are a distant owl, the hush of water slipping along a stone channel, and the occasional breeze fluttering the edges of silk tapestries hanging from the gardens colonnades. Then-crack.a. Branch, once made brittle by drought and ignored by its attendant, breaks loose from an overgrown neem tree. It falls directly onto the tiled path outside the women's quarters, and inside, the emperor stirs. What happened next in moments like this was rarely written down in full, but fragments appear in the margins of royal correspondence, gardeners, logs, and administrative reports, and piecing them together gives us a surprisingly vivid picture of what it meant to be a Mughal gardener. When things went wrong, let's begin with the structure. The Mughal imperial gardens were not unregulated. Idols. They were maintained through a hierarchy, much like any military or religious institution. At the base were the bagbens, ordinary gardeners and water carriers. Above them were the mutamims, or garden supervisors, men with decades of experience, and, often, letters of recommendation from noble patrons. The highest rank was reserved for the Nakshonavis, or garden architects, those who planned layouts, adjusted water flow, and submitted seasonal proposals to the imperial court. But make no mistake, even the humblest bagban was held to a strict code: cleanliness, quiet, consistency. When something broke that code, the consequences could range from a sharp warning to outright dismissal. One record from Akbar's court in Fetehpur Sikri describes a young gardener named Rahim, who forgot to close a sluice gate before sunrise. The eastern quadrant of the royal garden flooded, creating soggy mud trails along the rose beds. Rahim was summoned not to court, but to the office of the There, he was given two choices: a formal whipping of 5 lashes, or the night shift, which meant solitary irrigation duty during the most mosquito-filled hours of the monsoon. He chose the latter. According to the record, he served in silence and with a copper bell filled with salt to ward off spirits and leeches. He was later promoted. The Mughal system of discipline was not arbitrary, though it revolved around the concept of Nazm. And in a palace where the emperor was believed to be the very axis of heaven and earth, the disruption of his rest was not just a personal offense, it was a metaphysical one. This is why even the smallest tasks were accompanied by ceremonial quiet. Lanterns used in pre-dawn watering were fitted with double screens to muffle their glow. Buckets were polished not for appearance, but so they wouldn't creak at the handle. Gardeners communicated in gestures or whispers. Elaborate hand signals were passed down like trade secrets. But even with all precautions, mistakes happened. And sometimes they happened under the wrong moon. The Mughals, like many empires, influenced by Persian and Indian traditions, paid close attention to the lunar calendar. Certain nights, particularly during Amavasya, the new moon, were considered inauspicious for loud tasks or new plantings. Gardens were to be tended gently, without significant movement or pruning. A slip during such a night was believed to cause not just displeasure, but imbalance. A cracked flower pot could be seen as an omen. A disturbed emperor during a new moon was to be avoided at all costs. So, how did gardeners navigate these risks? One method was delegation. The Mughal palaces employed a rotating team of nighttime gardeners known as kamash, bagbans, literally silent gardeners. These were the most trusted of all. Older, highly skilled, often semi-retired men whose job was to tend only the most delicate plants near the emperor's chamber. They were paid slightly more, worked fewer hours, and often had the privilege of wearing softer clothes dyed cotton instead of coarse linen to make less noise. One such man, named Yusuf the Elder, left behind a curious diary in Persian script, copied years later by a court scribe. In it, he describes how he once repaired a leaking fountain valve using nothing but wax, string, and his own shirt cuff, so that the emperor's dream would not be troubled by the sound of splashing. His reward was a gold coin pressed into his hand at breakfast by the emperor's steward, with a note for the silence. Then there were the adaptations. In colder seasons, when metal watering cans clinked against stone walkways, gardeners began wrapping them in strips of wool. The practice spread across several gardens, and a specific kind of muffling wrap was even recorded in the inventory of Shah Jahan's Red Fort garden stores. Cloth was dyed blue, the color of coolness and sleep. Even tools were redesigned. Pruning. Shears were made with thinner blades and lined handles. Water scoops were carved from soft teak rather than clanking bronze. A new form of rackshort, wide, nearly soundless, was introduced in the imperial gardens of Kashmir and spread rapidly to Lahore and Delhi. And all of this, the redesigns, the silence, the discipline, was not just for beauty. It was to serve the emperor's experience of perfection. For when he awoke and walked the garden at dawn, he was not supposed to think about the labor. The rows should seem effortless. The sound of water should appear eternal. The gravel path should feel freshly swept, as if the world itself had arranged itself for his feet. A single twig in the wrong place could ruin the illusion. But one might ask, didn't the emperor know? Was he truly unaware of the hundreds of hands that maintained his paradise while he slept? Some records suggest that the emperors were more involved than we might think. Babur famously participated in designing his own gardens and wrote extensively about their flaws and virtues. Jahangir once paused an audience to send for a particular gardener who had coaxed a fig tree into flowering early. Even Aurangzeb, often depicted as austere, once intervened to pardon a gardener accused of overwatering jasmine, writing, "Let beauty be judged in the light of dawn, not punishment." So yes, the emperors knew, but they preferred not to see the effort. The perfection of the garden was its own mask, and those who labored behind that mask were valued most when they were invisible. Still, one can't help but wonder what became of the gardeners whose efforts were forgotten, who carried water for 30 years and never once saw the emperor smile. Their stories are not often recorded, but in the next section, we'll explore the lives of those anonymous hands, their routines, their humor, and what they left behind among the roots and fountains of Mughal paradise. The gardener's legacy beneath the petals. You return now to the garden. The sun is rising soft, golden light soaking into the walls of red sandstone and white marble. The fountains are just beginning their daily rhythm, and a thin mist hovers low over the garden beds. It is peaceful, and if you listen closely, you'll hear nothing. That is exactly how it was meant to be. But long after the emperors were gone, long after their courts were silenced and their palaces turned to monuments, the gardens remained, and so did the traces, quiet, enduring traces of the gardeners who once tended them. Who were these men? Most came from humble backgrounds. Many were the sons and grandsons of previous gardeners, inheriting not titles or land, but knowledge, a deep, wordless knowledge of soil, root systems, water flow, and seasonal timing. They knew when to sow and when to stop, when to prune and when to wait. Their names were rarely recorded in royal documents only. The mutamims and architects were credited in official chronicles, but in the local ledgers, in the neighborhood memories passed down orally near Lahore, Delhi, or Agra, these bagbons lived on. Some names we do have. A gardener named Nisamuddin, who maintained the sunken beds of the Hayat Baksh Garden in Delhi for over 40 years, was known for growing roses that bloomed 1 week earlier than anyone else's. A family of 3 brothers in Kashmir, Shakir, Moya and Imran, were employed for nearly 60 years across 3 reigns to manage the China trees lining the Shalima Canal. They developed a method of air pruning using silk nets to gently shape tree growth without breaking branches. Their tools were simple. Each gardener carried a cloth satchel. Inside, you might find a wooden dibber for planting bulbs, a copper scoop worn smooth by years of lifting water, a dull-bladed knife for trimming soft stems, and often a scrap of cloth soaked in rose water for cleaning, for cooling the face. And sometimes, simply to inhale on particularly long nights. They also carried poems. Yes, poems. You see, the Mughal garden was not just a place of plants, it was a place of poetry. Court poets wrote verses about tulips and jasmine, likening them to lovers, stars, and divine light. But gardeners composed their own poetry, 2 short, earthy couplets scratched onto walls, sung to themselves under their breath, or traded, like riddles, over shared lentils in the worker kitchens. One such verse, found scrawled in fading ink on the back of a garden ledger from 1706, reads, "The emperor walks where roses bloom, but it is my back that carries the spring." That kind of quiet humor, humble, observant, a little cheeky, was typical. Gardeners, after all, lived with the earth. They knew how emperors changed with the seasons, just like fruit trees. How the same ruler who demanded silence in March would complain about mosquitoes in May. And yet the work went on. Their days were long in summer. They rose before dawn and napped under fig trees in the heat of the afternoon. In winter, they lit small braziers near the water channels to keep frost from forming. There were always tasks: deadheading, marigolds, cleaning pebbles, brushing paths, inspecting fountains for algae. Yet, despite this unending work, gardeners were not without their own moments of peace. Some grew secret corners of the garden just for themselves. A patch of tulsi, a jasmine trellis bent into a hidden bench. One anonymous bagbong at the Mehtab bog across the Yamuna from the Taj Mahal carved his name, Asif, into a low stone beside a cypress. His carving was so small and unobtrusive that it was only discovered in the 1990s during restoration work. It simply read, "Watered for 22 years. May the trees remember me." And perhaps they did. In the tradition of Mughal garden design, trees were often planted with both utility and symbolism in mind. The pomegranate for prosperity, the neem for healing, the cypress for immortality. To tend these trees was, in a way, to tend memory itself. Gardeners understood that while the emperor might not remember their names, the trees might. The earth, they believed, did not forget. When the empire weakened and the great courts began to crumble, the royal gardens suffered. Maintenance was cut, fountains dried, flower beds grew wild. But in many cases, the descendants of the original gardeners stayed on. Not because they were paid, but because they felt responsible. A kind of ancestral duty, passed down not by decree, but by habit, by footstep, by touch, even into the colonial period. British officials remarked sometimes with amused confusion at how some Mughal gardens still operated on the same old schedules. Local men would appear before dawn, tend the same beds, water from the same wells, and disappear again before breakfast. No one had hired them, they simply showed up, and in doing so, they preserved something more than plants. They preserved The rhythm, the slow, sleepy rhythm of tending something not for applause, but for perfection. A garden where each petal was turned toward the sun at just the right angle, and each path swept just enough to seem untouched. Where silence was both a skill and a gift, and they left behind more than footprints. They left behind cuttings, soil, routines, irrigation tricks passed from uncle to nephew. A way of holding a watering scoop so the splash landed like rain, not thunder. A method for layering night-blooming jasmine and day-blooming hibiscus so the scent remained constant. These were their legacies, small, fragrant, quietly alive, and now, if you ever walk through an old Mughal garden, if you find yourself in Shalima, or Humanene's tomb, or the Meta bog, you might sense it. A presence, a quiet continuity. Someone once walked here in the dark with bare feet and a watering pot, making sure the emperor slept well, and in a way, that effort never stopped, because the water still flows and the flowers still bloom even when no one is watching, even when everyone has fallen asleep.